Are you interested in keeping your bones healthy year after year? I know I am. I'm pushing 50, and one of the biggest things on my mind is making sure that my bones stay healthy. Osteoporosis and low bone density affect over half of adults over the age of 50, and that means if you don't know what you're doing and you're not on top of your diet, you run the risk of having the low bone density, the osteoporosis, taking unnecessary medications, and all the complications that come with unhealthy aging. And today I'm going to share with you one of the easiest yet the most under-recognized ways that we can reverse the age-related decline in bone density that affects most of us. So if you're interested in keeping your bones healthy, stay tuned, because I'm going to teach you about a secret ingredient that's in almost all the foods you eat that is slowly eroding your bones. And if you're new to this channel, I'm Dr. Dave Clayton, and I drop a new video every week teaching you how to use fitness and nutrition to measurably improve your health at any age. So let's get started talking about bone health, and let's get into what is this ingredient that's slowly eroding our bones. Well, to start with, this is a big problem. It affects over half of adults over the age of 50. So whether you're in your late 30s, your 40s, or 50s and beyond, you've got to know how to keep your bones healthy, because this is a huge problem. And if you get low bone density, you got to take all these drugs, and then you run the risk of a fracture. And if you have a fracture, that really is bad news, because the chances of you dying from any cause after a hip fracture, for example, go up dramatically. And we definitely don't want to see that. We want to live vital, healthy lives at any age, and we want to enjoy that retirement. So no matter what your age today, you want to start getting this stuff right. So when you go to the doctor and they teach you, you ask them, what should I do for my bones? You get weight-bearing exercise, you get your calcium, you get your vitamin D. But if it's that easy, why is everybody having this problem? And the reason is that there is something in our diets that makes it impossible for us to put the calcium in the bones where it belongs. In fact, a lot of us end up having that calcium, and it either ends up causing arterial plaques and causing those to firm up and calcify, or we end up just peeing it all out, right? How do you get it to go in the bone? And the most important way that you can do this is to eat an alkaline diet. And one of the biggest reasons why that's so hard nowadays is because there's a highly potent acid that is in our food supply, and you're eating it all the time. So what is that acid? It is sodium chloride. Salt, table salt, sodium chloride is metabolized by your body into an acid, and it's in almost all the foods that we eat. It's in the processed foods, it's in the takeout foods, it's in breads. It finds its way insidiously into everything that we eat, and it slowly erodes your bones. In fact, studies show that about 15% of your bone mass is lost every 10 years due to an acidic diet. And sodium chloride makes up almost 50% of the acid burden compared to your regular diet. So getting rid of that salt is actually one of the biggest ways that you can prevent bone loss. It's one of the easiest ways that you can start making sure that calcium ends up in bone, and it's one of the most under-recognized ways of doing it. I mean, when was the last time you went to your doctor and they told you get rid of the salt to help your bones grow? It doesn't happen. We talk about calcium and vitamin D and weight-bearing exercise, but nobody's talking about the salt. So let's dig into a little bit of the science so that you understand why this is a problem and why getting rid of the salt makes a huge difference. So let's start with the pH scale. So the pH is a way of measuring the acidity of your diet. 0 is highly acidic, 7 is neutral, and more basic or alkaline is anything greater than 7 all the way up to 14. And the human body likes to be at a relatively alkaline pH of 7.4, and your body will control this really, really tightly. We like to be at 7.4, and we won't let that slip by more than a few hundredths of a point in either direction. Why? Because your survival depends on it. You cannot survive in an acidic or an alkaline environment. So your body's going to regulate this really tightly, and it'll sacrifice almost anything to do it, including your bones. Now, your bones are made up of calcium phosphate and other calcium salts. And in fact, the anions, the negatively charged ions that are bound to calcium, and that includes phosphate, these are a repository of basic substance that can be used to buffer acid in the diet. So the more acidic your diet, the more your body is going to cannibalize bone in order to maintain that pH balance. We have regulatory mechanisms. When we exhale carbon dioxide, we actually lower the acidity of our body. So we alkalinize the body by exhaling carbon dioxide. Our kidneys also have the ability to either excrete or retain acid. So that's another big mechanism that we use to regulate our pH. But over 2.5 million years, we evolved on an alkaline diet. In fact, if we go back 7 million years, our primate ancestors, they had a plant-based diet that was 100% alkaline. We introduced meat about 2 million years ago, so that slightly acidified our diet. But we maintained a relatively alkaline diet throughout most of human evolution. And that's probably why we like to be at that pH of 7.4 and not 7.0. So if we look at the foods on the basis of whether they contribute acid or base to our diet, what we see is that most of the foods that are on the acidic side, including table salt, were introduced just a few thousand years ago. Cheese and grains, sodas for sure, coffee. So if we look at all of these foods and liquids that are net acid contributors, what we see is that they didn't exist a few thousand years ago. These are new to our diet. And in fact, when we look at the average nutritional composition of what our caveman ancestors ate just maybe 100,000 years ago, 2 million years ago, what we see is that they got the bulk of their nutrition from fruits and vegetables. Only about 35 to maybe 50% of their diet was meat. 50 to 65% was alkaline fruits and vegetables. So we evolved on an alkaline diet. Our body's buffering systems, our ability to metabolize acid, were really honed in an environment where we didn't see huge chronic acid burdens the way we do today. Now, let's look at salt as an acid, because that's what it is. Sodium chloride is metabolized into an acid. And if we look at how much salt we get today versus how much we evolved on a diet that had about 500 to 700 milligrams of sodium chloride in the context of all natural foods. It's part of, we have sodium chloride in our bodies, animals do too, plants do, but it's not much. It really isn't. And in fact, what we see though is that today, the way we've added salt to our food supply, your average American is getting 3.6 grams of sodium per day. That is a lot more than the 500 to 700 milligrams that we used to get over millions of years. And that net acid load, that huge increase in the amount of acid we're putting into our bodies, has significant implications for our bone health. It actually impacts a lot of other conditions like hypertension and heart disease and strokes, kidney disease, kidney stones. So all of these are related to our sodium balance and the sodium excess. So when we think about what we can do with reducing the amount of salt in our diet, improving bone health is just one of many things that are related to that excess sodium in the diet. So let's see what happens to bone when we add an acid load to the body. Well, markers of calcium absorption go down, markers of bone destruction go up, and our bone density goes down. So what we see is that you end up leaching calcium out of the bone in order to buffer that acid in the body, and it leads to a steady loss of, like I said, 15% of your bone mass per decade. So huge amounts of bone loss. If we add that up from our 20s and our 30s and our 40s and our 50s, it's no wonder so many people can't get better with this prescription for calcium and vitamin D, because it doesn't let the calcium stick to the bone, right? So let's look at what happens when we alkalinize the diet. And one of the biggest ways that we can do this is get rid of the acid load, right? I mean, we could buffer that acid load with, all sorts of different ways, but getting rid of the sodium drops the acid load by at least a third, maybe even more. So if we alkalinize our diet, what you see here on this graph is that we start with a very acidic diet, and this is not a experimental diet. This is a average American diet with grains, with salt, with sodas, with meats. And when we look at that acid load and then we add a buffer, so we're going to add a buffer to the body by ingesting it. In this case, it's a potassium salt. And when we add that buffer, what do you see? The acid load drops dramatically, like instantaneously, the acidity of the body drops. And then when we take away that buffer, the acidity goes up. And it's clear to see that if we want to maintain that pH, it's better to do it by changing the diet, because otherwise you see this drop in acidity, you're getting that from your bones. I mean, that's all that base coming out of your bones to neutralize the acid. If we just take away the acid, then we don't have this problem. But if we look at what happened to bone markers while we alkalinized our diet, what we see is that there's a significant increase in bone growth factors, and there's a significant decrease in markers associated with bone destruction. So what you see is that alkalinizing the diet is one of the most significant ways that you can start priming your body to build rather than destroy bone as you age. And it's as simple as getting rid of the salt to start. Now, the other thing you could do is add potassium. Now, potassium tends to be an alkalinizing agent. It makes your body more alkaline. And where do we find that in abundance in our diet? It's in the fruits and vegetables. So increasing the amount of fruits and vegetables and getting rid of the salt is one of the most important ways that we can increase bone density and slow bone loss as we age. So my encouragement today would be to look at all the ways that you have salt in your diet. Takeout food, notorious for high salt content. Processed foods, notorious for high salt content. You can assume that if anybody is selling you food, they've put a lot of salt in it because we've got an evolutionary taste for salt. So getting rid of the processed foods, kind of sticking to more all-natural fruits and vegetables, meats, anything that somebody hasn't touched before they put it to your table. Steering clear of grains. Baked goods always have salt, either salt or baking powder or baking soda. So there's tons of salt in baked goods. And then just putting down the table salt or limiting the amount that you add to your cooking. These are all ways that you can reduce your sodium intake. It's an interesting fact, though, that a very small amount of the sodium in the average American diet comes from the salt shaker. It's only about 10% maybe of your total salt intake during the day. So if you want to put a couple of twists of salt on your meat or your vegetables, that's probably not the end of the world. Your average kind of dose of table salt is maybe 100, 200 milligrams, depending on how ambitious you are or aggressive you are with the salt shaker. But it's really getting rid of the restaurant foods and the processed foods and the baked goods where you make a huge impact on your sodium load. And then what you can do is really just look for ways to increase the amount of fruits and vegetables in your diet, because those are going to alkalinize your diet and start shifting you in that positive direction where your kidneys aren't overworked and we're not leaching calcium out of your bone in order to buffer your pH. So I'm going to leave some links I'm going to leave some links below so that you can check out my research if you're interested in digging deeper. I'll leave a link to my website, and I've got tons of great resources there where you can learn more about acid-base, pH, and sodium-potassium balance. I'm a big believer that sodium-potassium balance is one of the biggest drivers of health as we age. So I encourage you to look into any of that. And I'm going to drop a new video every week, so stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.